I'm Dixie, 23 years old, a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. On the battlefield, I'm a steel shield. But every time I step back into that lavish colonial home in Fairfield County, I'm stripped of my dignity, becoming a servant living in a damp basement. I scrub floors starting at 4 a.m., while my brother Brandon sleeps until noon on a king-sized bed. For 23 years, the woman who calls herself my mother hammered a curse into my brain. Some children are born to be served. Some children are born to serve others. You belong to the second category. I never doubted that. It all ended at his wedding. When the bride's father, a billionaire, stopped and looked at me, his hands trembling as he asked, "Do you know who your biological mother is?" Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you really want to hear what happens next. And if you're watching, leave a comment letting me know where you're from and what time it is for you. Now, let me take you back to the morning of Brandon's wedding, the day I thought would be the worst of my life. 0500 hours. Fairfield County, Connecticut. Down in the basement, the air tasted like damp concrete and mothballs. A single yellow bulb hummed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows across the cinder block walls. I stood over the ironing board, the steam from the iron hitting my face. I didn't mind the heat. It was better than the bone-chilling cold of New England that always seemed to seep through the floorboards of this house. I was working on my army dress blues. Every crease had to be sharp enough to draw blood. I ran the iron over the heavy blue fabric, my eyes fixed on the NCO stripes and the brass buttons. They were the only things in this world that actually belonged to me. The only things that proved I was more than just a ghost in the machine. Then came the click-clack of sharp heels on the wooden stairs. Donna Patterson didn't knock. She never did. She stepped into the basement like she was entering a cage at the zoo. Her face was already painted for the wedding, flawless, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. "What are you doing with that trash?" she snapped, her voice like a jagged piece of glass. I didn't look up. "It's my uniform, Donna. I have a ceremony next week." Before I could react, she reached out and snatched the jacket off the board. The hangers screeched against the metal. With one violent motion, she hurled it toward the corner. My dress blues hit the wet, oil-stained concrete floor with a dull thud. The silver ribbons, awards I'd earned while being shot at in dust-choked border towns, rattled as they struck the ground. "Today isn't about your little dress-up game," she hissed, tossing a bundle of white fabric at my face. "It's about Brandon. This is your uniform for today. Your mission is simple. Serve the wine and stay invisible." It was a cheap, thin white apron, the kind you'd buy in bulk at a restaurant supply store. My pulse hammered against my throat. Every instinct I'd honed in training screamed at me to move. My hands balled into fists, my knuckles turning white. I could have ended her in 4 seconds. I knew exactly where to strike, but I didn't. I shut my eyes. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. I forced my heart rate down to a steady 60 beats per minute. In the Army, they teach you to lock your emotions in a black box when the world goes to hell. In this house, I'd been doing that since I was 5. I knelt. My knees hit the cold concrete. I carefully picked up my uniform, shaking off the dust, and placed it on my thin cot. Then, I put on the apron. "Move it," Donna barked. "The floors in the kitchen ain't gonna polish themselves." I climbed the stairs and stepped into a different world. Upstairs, the house smelled like expensive wood wax and fresh lilies. I knelt on the kitchen floor with a microfiber cloth, scrubbing a water spot off the island. It wasn't just any island. It was a massive slab of Calicut marble, imported from Italy, white with gray veins that looked like cracks in ice. My shoulder throbbed, a dull, nagging ache from a bullet graze I took last month during a border patrol mission in the Middle East. The hazard pay I'd sent home while sleeping in the dirt had paid for this very slab of stone. Every cent of my blood money was literally under my fingernails as I polished the marble. And yet, I didn't even have a chair at the dining table. Brandon Patterson drifted down the stairs, yawning. He was 26 and had never worked a day in his life. He looked sharp in his silk tuxedo, the fabric shimmering under the recessed lighting. He didn't even look at me. He just stepped over my legs as if I were a rug. "Coffee's cold, Dixie," he muttered, checking his reflection in the oven door. "Fix it, and don't get any grease on my shoes." I didn't say a word. I just kept scrubbing. By 1,000 hours, the colonial mansion was crawling with the elite of Fairfield County. A $200,000 wedding. The air was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5 and ego. I stood in the corner of the grand ballroom, my back straight, heels together, feet at a 45-degree angle. My eyes were on a swivel, automatically scanning the room for exits, points of entry, and blind spots. It was a tactical reflex I couldn't switch off. But instead of my M4 carbine, my hands were wrapped around a heavy stainless steel tray. It was loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. The metal was so cold it felt like it was burning into the calluses on my palms. I watched them, the Pattersons. They were laughing, clinking glasses, playing the role of the perfect wealthy family for their high society guests. Brandon was at the center of it all, grinning like he'd actually accomplished something by getting born. I was the help, the invisible girl from the basement. I stood there, a highly trained soldier serving drinks to people who wouldn't notice if I disappeared tomorrow. My grip tightened on the tray until my fingers bled into the white cloth wrapped around the handle. I looked at Gerald and Donna. They were beaming at the crowd, basking in the glory of their lies. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me. I took a breath, my eyes locking onto Gerald's smug face from across the room. He didn't know I was watching. He didn't know that every second I stood there, I was recording every detail, every exit, and every weakness. Why was I still here? Why was a soldier with a rifle and a set of skills most people couldn't imagine still standing here like a slave? The answer lay in the drawer of Gerald's desk, but I didn't know that yet. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors swung open. Richard Whitmore, the bride's father and a man worth billions, stepped inside. He wasn't smiling. His eyes swept the room, ignoring the Pattersons, until they landed directly on me. The room went quiet. I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical blow. My mission to stay invisible was about to be blown wide open. The violin music upstairs was thick and sweet, like cheap syrup. It drifted through the floorboards of the Fairfield mansion, clashing with the cold, dead silence of the hallway where I stood. To the guests in the ballroom, that music signaled romance and high-class elegance. To me, it was a trigger. It sounded exactly like the high-pitched hum of the radiator in the basement, the only sound I'd had for company during the long nights of my childhood. I shifted the weight of the silver tray. My back was a roadmap of stories the Pattersons tried to bury. People ask why I didn't just walk out, why a girl who could survive a desert ambush stayed in a house that treated her like a stray dog. They don't understand how you break a human being. It's not just the hits, it's the rules. Pinned behind the door of my basement room was a yellowed sheet of paper. I'd memorized it by age 7. Rule number 1, you do not use the words mom or dad. They are Mr. and Mrs. Patterson. You are an occupant, not a daughter. Rule number 2, you eat after the family is finished. You eat standing up by the kitchen sink. You do not touch the dining table. That table. It was heavy oak back then, before the Calicut marble took its place. I remember when I was 15. It was a Tuesday. It was raining hard, the kind of New England storm that turns the sky the color of a bruised lung. I was exhausted from scrubbing the baseboards, and, for one reckless second, I sat down. I didn't even sit on the good furniture. I sat on the edge of the frayed sofa in the den. Gerald walked in. He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. That was his specialty, the cold, quiet psyops. He just walked over to the pantry, reached behind the oversized box of cornflakes, and pulled out the rattan cane. The sound it made cutting through the air, a sharp sh-tack, is a sound you never forget. He caught me across the shoulder blades 3 times. I didn't scream. I just bit my lip until I tasted the copper tang of blood. Even now, standing in this $200,000 wedding, my scars flare up whenever the wind shifts. Outside, I'm a soldier who ain't afraid of a firefight. In here, That snapping sound still makes me go stone cold. By 16, the pressure cooker in my head finally blew. I waited until 200 hours. I jimmied the lock on the back door with a butter knife and ran. I had $17 in crumpled singles stuffed into the toe of my sneaker, money I'd scavenged from the floor mats of the family cars while cleaning them. I made it 3 miles. 3 miles of cold, wet freedom before the red and blue lights of a cruiser cut through the fog. I thought the cops would save me. I really did. But then Gerald showed up. He looked like a broken man. He didn't look like the monster with the rattan cane. He looked like a grieving father. He actually squeezed out a few tears for the officers. "She's had a hard time," he told them, his voice shaking with fake emotion. "Reactive attachment disorder. Severe trauma from her real parents. Please, just help me get her home safely." The cops looked at my $17, looked at my dirty sneakers, and then looked at the wealthy man in the expensive wool coat. They didn't ask me a single question. They just handed me back. The second that patrol car door slammed shut, Gerald's face went blank. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me straight down to the basement. "You want to run?" he whispered. "Let's see how far you get in the dark." He locked the door. No food, no light, just the smell of mold and the sound of my own shallow breathing. I stayed in that hole for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the bolt slid back. Gerald didn't bring breakfast. He brought a chair. He sat down right in front of me, leaning in so close I could smell the stale cigar smoke on his breath and the expensive cologne Donna bought him. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice a low, terrifying crawl. "I went through the safe last night," he said. "Guess what I didn't find? A birth certificate, a social security card, an adoption decree. Nothing, Dixie. You don't exist. You're a ghost, and nobody looks for a ghost. If you leave this house, you're just an illegal vagrant. No job, no school, no life. I'm the only reason you aren't in a cage or a gutter." That was the kill shot. He didn't just break my body. He erased my soul. I was a nothing living in a house of somethings. I stood there in the dark after he left, touching the cinder block walls, wondering if my hands were even real. If you've ever felt like your voice was being smothered by the people who were supposed to protect you, I need to know I'm not alone. It takes a different kind of courage to survive the wars inside your own home. Drop a "stay strong" in the comments if you've ever had to fight for your own identity, and hit that like button to help me get this story out to those still trapped in the dark. I looked up from my tray. Brandon was laughing at some joke, his tuxedo fitting him perfectly. He had a name. He had a history. He had a paper trail that went back generations. I was just Dixie, a ghost in a white apron. But Gerald made one mistake. He told me I was a ghost, so I started acting like one. I learned to move without a sound. I learned to watch without being seen. I learned to survive on nothing. He thought he'd cursed me to stay forever. He didn't realize he was training me for the only place in America that would give a ghost a name and a number. I looked at the heavy oak desk in the corner of the den, the one place I was never allowed to go. If I was going to find out who I really was, I'd have to stop being a ghost and start being a soldier. The question was, how does a girl with no birth certificate join the most powerful army on Earth? I walked 5 miles through a New England nor'easter on my 18th birthday. The snow didn't just fall, it cut like a serrated blade. My boots were held together by duct tape and prayers, the soles flapping against the slush like a dying heart. I didn't look back at the colonial house on the hill. I didn't care if the wind took it. I just headed for the neon army sign glowing in the gray fog 3 towns over. The recruitment station smelled like stale coffee, wet wool, and floor wax. I stood there, shivering, dripping gray water onto the linoleum. The sergeant behind the desk was a slab of a man with eyes that had seen too much sand and too little sleep. He looked at my duct-taped boots, then up at my face. He didn't see a girl. He saw a hollowed-out shell with a spark of pure, unadulterated spite at the center. "I don't have a birth certificate, Sergeant," I said. My voice was a rasp, stripped raw by the cold. He didn't ask why. He didn't call the cops or ask about my folks. He just sighed, reached into a dented metal drawer, and shoved a blank sheet of white paper across the scarred desk. "Write an affidavit," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Swear to who you are. We'll do the rest." I grabbed the pen. My fingers were blue, but my grip was iron. I didn't write Patterson. I wrote Dixie Aguirre, a name I'd found on a cracked gravestone in the old cemetery behind the basement window. I scratched that name into existence until the ink bled through the paper. In that moment, the ghost died. I wasn't an occupant anymore. I had a name. And soon, I had a service number. The Army didn't give a damn about my feelings. They just wanted my spine. I learned to ruck 30 kilograms of gear through knee-deep mud until my toenails fell off. I learned to reset my own broken bones and keep marching because stopping meant failing the only people who ever counted on me. The military taught me how to bite down on the pain, and they paid me for my stubbornness. For the first time in my life, my sweat was worth something. My bruises weren't just marks of shame, they were badges of trade. I built a fortress inside my head, brick by disciplined brick. Out in the dust-choked border towns of the Middle East, I was a shield. My comrades trusted me with their lives. They didn't see a servant, they saw an NCO who knew how to hold the line when the world was screaming. I'd even thrown my own body over a dummy grenade during a training drill to save a private who'd frozen in fear. That was the real Dixie Aguirre. But every time I had to go back to Fairfield County on leave, the fortress walls started to crumble. The second I stepped over the Pattersons' threshold, the psyops would kick in. The uniform felt like a costume. The stripes on my arms seemed to fade. I'd find myself grabbing a rag and scrubbing the floors, hoping, just once, to see a glimmer of respect in Donna's cold eyes or a nod of approval from Gerald. I was still that starving dog looking for a scrap of affection. Pop. The sound of a champagne cork pulled me back from the heat of the desert, right into the middle of this $200,000 circus. I was standing in the corner of the ballroom, my white apron tied tight over my dignity. The scent of lilies was suffocating. Brandon was drifting toward me, flanked by a group of his old money buddies. They all looked like they'd been dipped in wax, shiny, expensive, and useless. Brandon was grinning, his face flushed from the gin. He pointed a finger at me, the one with the massive diamond wedding band that cost more than my first 3 years of service. "Hey, check it out, guys," he laughed, his voice loud enough to cut through the string quartet. He didn't even look me in the eye. He just treated me like a piece of furniture he was showing off. "Meet the help. This is our housekeeper, Dixie." Housekeeper. The word hit me like a physical blow to the gut. His friends chuckled, one of them making a snide comment about my military posture while I was doing the dishes. I stood there, a soldier who'd survived the worst the world could throw at her, being reduced to a housekeeper by a man who couldn't even tie his own silk tie without help. My hand tightened on the stainless steel tray. The metal groaned under the pressure. I felt the sharp edge of the tray bite into the meat of my palm, but I didn't let go. Warmth started to seep through the white cloth handle, blood. I was squeezing so hard my knuckles were actually bleeding through the skin. I looked at Brandon's smug, laughing face. He thought I was just a ghost in an apron. He thought I was broken. He had no idea that the housekeeper was currently scanning the room for the quickest way to dismantle everything he loved. Suddenly, a shadow fell over our little group. The laughter died in Brandon's throat. I didn't turn my head, but my tactical radar went to red alert. A tall man was standing right behind Brandon. Richard Whitmore. He wasn't looking at Brandon. He was staring at my hand, the one dripping blood onto the expensive hardwood floor. The flash bulbs were blinding. Every few seconds, a white explosion ripped through the ballroom. Frozen smiles etched onto the faces of the Fairfield elite. It was time for the legacy portrait, the centerpiece of the Patterson family's social charade. "All right, everyone, family only. Tighten it up," the photographer barked, waving his hands like he was conducting a symphony. I didn't need to be told twice. I'd been trained to exist in the margins. I performed my tactical retreat, backing away into the shadows by the heavy velvet curtains. I executed the ghost protocol Gerald had hammered into me since I was a kid. I was just a blur in the background, a smudge on the lens, but Gerald wasn't satisfied with me being in the shadows. He wanted me erased. From the center of the frame, tucked in his charcoal gray wool suit, Gerald caught my eye. His face darkened. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just made a sharp, flicking motion with his wrist. A shooing gesture. The kind of dismissive wave you'd use for a stray dog that had wandered onto a country club porch. Beat it. That was the message. Get out of the frame. You're staining the scenery. I felt the familiar sting in my gut, but I didn't let it reach my face. I spun on my heel, ready to vanish into the kitchen hallway. Hold it. The voice didn't come from Gerald. It was a low, resonant baritone that cut right through the chatter of the ballroom. Richard Whitmore stepped out of the formation. The billionaire father of the bride didn't look like he was having a good time. He looked like a man who had just seen something that didn't sit right with him. He ignored the photographer. He ignored the confused murmurs of the guests. He walked straight toward me. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the faint clink of ice in a glass across the room. Richard didn't look at my cheap, stained apron. He didn't look at the tray in my hand. He looked right into my eyes, a long, searching stare that felt like a spotlight on my soul. "She's family," Richard said. He didn't ask. He stated it like a law. "Get in here. You stand next to me." I froze. My internal radar was screaming, "System error." In 23 years, no one had ever used that word, family, to describe me. Especially not in front of people who counted. Gerald's face turned a violent shade of crimson. I could see the vein in his temple throbbing, a thin blue line of pure rage. He looked like he was about to choke on his own tongue. But he didn't say a word. Richard Whitmore was the checkbook for this entire event. In Fairfield, you don't bite the hand that's feeding your ego. Richard reached out and gripped my shoulder. His hand was large, heavy, and solid. The heat from his palm seeped through the thin fabric of my apron, hitting the spot where the rattan cane scars lived. My body reacted before my brain did. I went into red alert. My muscles turned to tempered steel. I girded my core, my weight shifting onto the balls of my feet, preparing for a strike that usually followed a touch like that. But the strike never came. Richard didn't hit. He held. It was a steady, grounding weight. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. Up close, I could see the silver in his hair and the deep lines of grief around his mouth. His eyes went watery, a sharp contrast to the cold arrogance of the room. "Those eyes," he whispered. His voice broke, just for a second. God, those eyes. I stood there, paralyzed by the humanity of it. It hurt. It hurt worse than the cane. It was the rank 3 void opening up, the realization that this stranger was treating me with more respect than the people who had claimed my life for 2 decades. My tactical radar swung to the left. 10 o'clock. Donna was standing 3 feet away. She looked like she'd been turned to stone. Her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass, her manicured nails digging into the crystal. She wasn't looking at Richard. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't the look of a mother worried about her child. It was the look of a criminal watching the evidence walk back into the room. Richard stepped back, his hand lingering on my shoulder for one last second before he pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket. He didn't wait for the photo. He turned his back on the Pattersons and started hitting numbers, his face turning grim and professional. "Yeah, it's me," Richard muttered into the phone, walking toward the terrace. "I need that file, now. And get the lab on standby. Something ain't right." The second the photographer lowered his camera, the family mask on Gerald's face disintegrated. The warmth he'd been faking for the guests vanished, replaced by the raw, jagged cruelty I knew so well. He moved fast. Before I could process Richard's phone call, Gerald was on me. He didn't care who was watching now. He grabbed me by the elbow, his fingers digging into my skin like iron claws. "Kitchen, now!" he hissed. He didn't walk me out. He hauled me. He dragged me through the swinging double doors and into the narrow, dark service corridor. This was the dead zone. No guests, no catering staff, and most importantly, no security cameras. The air here smelled like garbage and floor cleaner. The transition from the bright ballroom to this pitch-black hallway was jarring. Gerald slammed me against the brick wall, his face inches from mine. I could smell the gin and the stale anger pouring off him. "You think you're special now?" he spat, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You think because that old man looked at you, something's changed? You're a dog, Dixie, a stray we found in the dirt, and if you don't keep your mouth shut, I'm gonna make sure you go back to the dirt. Permanently." He leaned in closer, the shadows swallowing his eyes. "I made you, and I can unmake you." I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just watched the sweat bead on his upper lip, waiting for the moment the ghost would have to fight back. The service corridor was a dead zone. It smelled like industrial-grade bleach, rotting garbage, and the stale, sour scent of Gerald's cigar smoke. The transition from the bright, high-society ballroom to this dim crawl space was jarring. But my eyes adjusted in seconds. That was the training. Always be ready for the light to go out. Gerald slammed me against the cold brick wall, his fingers digging into my arm like iron hooks. He was sweating, the gin from the reception making his skin slick and his breath heavy. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his eyes narrowed into jagged slits. "You think you're cute, Dixie?" he hissed, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You think because Whitmore looked at you, you've got a seat at the big table? Listen to me, and listen good. If you say one word to him, one single damn word, I'm gonna burn your life to the ground. I'll draft a letter to your CO. I'll file every piece of paperwork I have to prove you're unstable. I'll bury your career before the sun comes up. You ain't nothing but a zero, a ghost from a basement. Remember your place." My jaw locked so tight I thought my teeth would crack. My pulse stayed steady, but my right hand twitched. My combat instincts were screaming, mapping out the strike. I could take his throat, snap his wrist, and have him on the floor in under 3 seconds. The urge to end him right there was a physical weight in my chest, but I didn't. I killed the impulse before it reached my muscles. I used my left hand to calmly, coldly brush his hand off my elbow like he was a piece of lint. I stood up straight, towering over him by an inch, and smoothed out the white apron over my waist. "Copy that," I said. My voice was flat. No emotion, no fear, just a report. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel door that led to the service stairs. I left him standing there in the dark, fuming and panting like a kicked cur. The roof was another world. The Connecticut wind whistled through the metal railings, sharp and biting against my skin. I stepped out onto the gravel surface, the sound of the wedding party below muffled by the height. Richard Whitmore was already there, leaning against the ledge, staring out at the Fairfield coastline. He looked older in the moonlight, the billionaire armor stripped away to reveal a man haunted by something deep. He didn't turn around when I approached. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a small frayed object. "Look at this," he said, his voice ragged. He handed me a photograph. It was old, the edges yellowed and soft from years of being touched. I looked down. A woman with chestnut hair and piercing green eyes stared back at me. She was laughing, holding a baby wrapped in a soft white blanket. Those eyes? They were the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. "Margaret," Richard choked out, his throat working hard. "My sister. That baby. She was taken from a park in Greenwich 23 years ago. My family spent millions. We hired everyone. We searched every corner of this country. We never stopped looking." He turned to me then, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Your name isn't Dixie Aguirre. You're Dixie Ashford Whitmore. You're my niece." The information hit me like an M84 flashbang. My ears rang. My vision blurred for a split second as my brain scrambled to re-index 23 years of lies. Margaret. My mother. Richard told me she never gave up. She spent every waking hour, every cent of her inheritance, trying to find that baby. 5 years ago, her heart simply couldn't take the strain anymore. She died of heart failure, still calling out for a daughter she hadn't seen since she was an infant. And while she was dying, I was downstairs in that Fairfield basement, scrubbing the floors of the people who had purchased me like a piece of livestock. The Pattersons weren't just abusers. They were human traffickers who had bought a kidnapped child for $15,000 to be their permanent, invisible servant. I didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry when the mission parameters change, they adapt. I felt a cold, hard target lock click into place in my mind. The grief was there, but it was fuel now. Richard pulled a medical-grade DNA collection kit from his pocket. He didn't ask for permission. He just held the sterile tube, his hands trembling. I didn't hesitate. I opened my mouth, feeling the rough cotton swab scrape against the lining of my cheek. It tasted bitter, like the truth. He sealed the tube and tucked it away. 72 hours, he whispered. That's how long the lab needs for the high-priority rush. 72 hours, I repeated. The countdown started right then. I looked back toward the door where I'd left Gerald. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I wasn't an occupant. I was a soldier on a recon mission, and the enemy was downstairs, celebrating a wedding with my mother's blood on their hands. I straightened my apron and headed back toward the stairs. I had 3 days to act like a servant while I prepared to burn their kingdom down. 72 hours. In the Army, 3 days is an eternity. It's enough time to take a hill, lose a city, or plan a total collapse of an enemy's front line. I spent mine in the basement, back in the hole where the air smelled like damp concrete, gray secrets, and the faint, bitter scent of the mothballs Donna used to hide the rot. I kept the mop moving. Swish, thud. The bucket clattered against the cracked linoleum floor, a sound that used to make me flinch when I was a kid. Back then, noise meant trouble. Now, it was just the rhythm of my recon mission. I wasn't just cleaning anymore, I was mapping. I watched Gerald's black Cadillac pull out of the gravel driveway at exactly 08:15 every morning. I noted the way Donna tucked her jewelry box into the false bottom of the linen closet. I tracked every penny Brandon blew on his credit cards at the local clubs. They thought I was still their broken little ghost, a servant who'd forgotten how to fight. They didn't see the NCO behind the white apron, recording every exit, every pattern, and every fatal weakness. Monday morning arrived like a slap to the face. The Patterson kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and entitlement. Brandon was slumped at the marble island, nursing a hangover and picking at a plate of cold eggs. He looked at his reflection in his polished Italian loafers and scowled, his face puffy and red. "Dixie, there's a scuff on my left toe," he barked, his voice cracking. He didn't even look up. "Fix it. I ain't going out looking like some bum from the street." Donna didn't even stop scrolling on her tablet. She just hasted her chin toward him, her eyes cold as ice. "You heard him. Get down there and clean it up," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, jagged poison. I didn't argue. I didn't glare. I just grabbed a rag, dropped to one knee, and started rubbing the leather. I was meticulous. I worked that rag until the scuff vanished, my face a mask of dull, robotic obedience. Rub, buff, repeat. I looked at Brandon's smug, laughing face. He actually smirked, enjoying the sight of an army sergeant on her knees. He had no idea. None of them did. They were laughing at a servant while they were quaking in the shadow of a woman worth $12 million. Every slap Gerald gave me, every night I spent hungry in the dark, it wasn't because I was nothing. It was because they knew I was everything they weren't. Every bruise was just a brick in the wall they'd built to hide the kidnapping. They were the thieves. I was the prize. My leave was officially up at 1200 hours on Wednesday. I packed my military rucksack in under 3 minutes. Everything I owned, which wasn't much, fit into that heavy olive drab bag. I walked out of that colonial house without a backward glance, the heavy oak door slamming behind me with a sound like a distant gunshot. I headed straight to a corner diner 3 towns over. It was a greasy spoon where the coffee was as black as engine oil and the booths were made of cracked red vinyl. The air smelled of bacon fat and old cigarette smoke. Richard was already there, tucked into a back corner booth away from the windows. 2 men in dark, nondescript suits sat with him. Their eyes were on a swivel, scanning the entrance for threats. FBI. I sat down. I didn't order. I just looked at Richard. His face was pale as a ghost, his hands trembling so hard he couldn't even lift his mug. Have you ever had that one moment where the truth finally catches up to the lies? That split second where the world stops turning and you realize everything you knew was a front. If you're rooting for justice to finally hit the Pattersons after 23 years, hit that like button right now. And do me a favor, drop a 99.9 in the comments. If you believe that no matter how deep you bury a secret, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Richard didn't say a word. He just reached into the pocket of his wool coat and slid a single sheet of printed paper across the grease-stained table. The paper felt rough and heavy in my hand, its weight more than just wood pulp. I looked down. There it was, printed in cold, clinical font that didn't care about the lives it was about to destroy. Probability of maternal match, 99.97%. The world didn't explode. There were no sirens, just the quiet, gut-wrenching sound of Richard finally breaking. He buried his face in his hands and started to sob, his shoulders shaking with 23 years of grief and relief. He wasn't a billionaire in that moment. He was just a brother who had finally found the child his sister died looking for. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I was too far gone for tears. I picked up the paper, folded it into a perfect, crisp square, and tucked it into the left breast pocket of my army blouse. It sat right over my heart, a shield of truth. I looked at the two FBI agents. They were waiting for a signal. The time for being a ghost was over. The time for being a housekeeper was dead. Confirmed, I said. My voice was steady, like a hammer hitting a nail. Start the operation. The invitation didn't come via email. That was too common, too easy to ignore. Richard Whitmore knew how to play people like Gerald Patterson. He sent a courier, a guy in a crisp suit riding a high-end motorcycle, to hand-deliver a gold-embossed card to the house in Fairfield. Inside, the text was short. It talked about strategic alignment and the transfer of a legacy trust to Brandon. It was the ultimate bait. The Pattersons didn't just take it, they choked on it. Gerald, look at this. Greenwich. We're finally going to his main estate. Donna squealed, her voice hitting a frequency that made the fine china rattle. She dropped everything. She canceled her hair appointment. Gerald stayed off the golf course for the first time in 3 years. They spent the next 6 hours digging through their closets, pulling out the most expensive labels they owned. Donna was draping herself in pearls that cost more than my first car. And Gerald was practicing his billionaire's handshake in the hallway mirror. They were so blinded by the shimmer of the Whitmore Trust Fund that they didn't notice the housekeeper wasn't in the kitchen. They didn't even ask where I went. To them, I was just a ghost that had finally learned to stay out of the way. They were wrong. While they were playing dress-up, I was 30 miles away in a basement that didn't smell like mold. It smelled like cold air conditioning and gun oil. This was Richard's private security hub in his Greenwich estate. No gold-embossed cards here, just whiteboards, fiber optic cables, and men with thick necks wearing earpieces. I stood at the head of the table. I wasn't hunched over a mop anymore. I was standing tall, my feet shoulder-width apart, my eyes locked on the two FBI special agents sitting across from me. They had a blueprint of the Patterson house pinned to the wall. The floorboards in the upstairs landing creak, I said, my voice flat and tactical. If you're doing a silent entry, you stay on the left rail. Gerald keeps the physical records in a floor safe under the master bed. The combination is his wedding anniversary, a date he only remembers because it's etched into his cufflinks. I pointed to the pantry. Donna's got a secondary stash of cash and unregistered jewelry behind the oversized boxes of cornflakes. She thinks she's clever. She ain't. The agents were taking notes, their faces grim. This wasn't just a divorce or a lawsuit. This was a federal human trafficking and kidnapping sweep. Every detail I gave them was another nail in the Pattersons' coffin. We timed it to the minute. While they were busy signing transfer papers with Richard, the feds would be tearing their Fairfield house apart. By 1400 hours, it was time for me to change. I went into the small dressing room Richard had prepared for me. I threw the civilian rags into the trash, the faded jeans, the cheap t-shirts, the apron. I reached into the garment bag and pulled out my army dress blues. I ran the iron over the fabric one last time. The steam hissed, filling the room with a clean, sharp scent. I spent 20 minutes on the brass buttons, polishing them until they shone like mirrors. I pinned my ribbons on my chest, each one a piece of skin and sweat I'd left in the dirt of foreign borders. I checked my reflection. I didn't see the girl who scrubbed marble floors. I saw NCO Aguirre. I saw a soldier. I saw the niece of a man who owned the sky. Today, there ain't no invisible girl, I whispered to the mirror. At 1600 hours, the sound of a high-performance engine echoed off the limestone walls of the Greenwich mansion. A black BMW rolled up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching like breaking glass. Gerald was behind the wheel, looking like he'd swallowed a diamond. Donna was in the passenger seat, already checking her lipstick in the sun visor. They stepped out smelling like department store perfume and unearned confidence. Brandon was with them, his tuxedo fitting him like a second skin. They walked through the massive front doors, their eyes darting around the marble foyer, calculating the net worth of every statue. They were led into the grand conference room. Richard was sitting at the far end of a mahogany table that looked 20 feet long. He didn't stand up. He just gestured for them to sit. I was already there. I stood in the corner, tucked into the shadows, my hands clasped behind my back in a parade rest position. I was as silent as a stone. Gerald glanced at me, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second when he saw the blue uniform, but he dismissed it. He probably thought Richard had hired some military honor guard for the trust fund ceremony. His greed was a blindfold he'd tied himself. Donna leaned forward, her eyes bright with the hunger for the check. Richard, we are so honored. This means the world to our family. Gerald nodded, his voice thick with fake sincerity. We've always known Brandon was destined for great things. Richard didn't say a word. He just looked at them. Then, the sound happened. A heavy metallic clack echoed through the room. It was the sound of the high-security electronic deadbolts engaging in the mahogany doors. The windows in the room were reinforced, bulletproof glass. There was only one way in, and now there was no way out. Brandon blinked, looking around at the walls. What was that? I stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The brass on my chest caught the afternoon sun, flashing like a warning signal. I didn't look at Donna. I didn't look at Brandon. I looked straight at Gerald. I saw the moment the grease of his confidence started to melt. He looked at the locked door, then back at me. The exits are secured, I said. My voice was like iron hitting ice. And the party is officially over. The air in the Greenwich conference room was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive mahogany and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending storm. Richard didn't look at the Pattersons. He sat at the head of the long table, his face a granite mask. He picked up a delicate bone china teacup, the steam curling around his fingers. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the polished wood. Gerald leaned forward, a greasy smile plastered across his face. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out like a rooster in a suit. Richard, we're ready to sign. Brandon's future is the only thing on our minds. Richard set the cup down. The clink of porcelain against the saucers sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and hollow. I've had the records pulled, Gerald. Every single one, from every county office in a 3-state radius. The smile on Gerald's face didn't fall. It froze. It turned into a brittle plastic mask. I found plenty of tax returns, Richard continued, his voice a low, dangerous crawl. I found mortgage papers and golf club memberships, but I didn't find a single sheet of paper with the name Dixie Patterson on it. No birth certificate, no adoption decree, nothing. Donna's hand twitched. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled chirp. Richard, you know how things were. There was that house fire back in '99. All the old files went up in smoke. We've told you this. Richard didn't blink. He reached into a leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He didn't hand them over. He hurled them. The papers slid across the glass tabletop, fanning out like a deck of cards. There, right on top, was a manila folder with a bright red federal seal. FBI. There was no fire, Richard snapped, but there was a wire transfer. $15,000. Paid into an offshore account owned by a man who's currently serving life for interstate kidnapping. Donna's teacup slipped from her fingers. It hit the thick Persian rug and shattered, the brown liquid seeping into the wool like a spreading bruise. She didn't even notice. Her face had gone the color of spoiled milk. She isn't your daughter. Richard's voice rose, vibrating with a decade of buried rage. She's my niece, Dixie Ashford Whitmore. You bought her like a piece of used farm equipment. The doors behind the Pattersons didn't just open, they exploded. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move. The shout was a thunderclap. 4 men in black windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow across the back stormed into the room. Their boots thudded against the hardwood. They didn't go for Richard. They went for the Pattersons. Gerald and Donna Patterson, the lead agent barked, his eyes fixed on Gerald's trembling face. You are under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit federal document fraud. Gerald tried to stand, his chair screeching against the floor. Wait! This is a mistake. Donna made me do it. She said we needed a girl to help around the house. I didn't know where she came from. Donna shrieked, her voice a jagged blade of panic. You liar! You were the one who talked to that man in the park. You took the money from the business. They were tearing each other apart before the cuffs even touched their skin. The perfect family was dissolving into a pit of vipers. I stepped out of the corner then. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a soldier approaching the firing line. My army dress blues were crisp, the brass on my chest catching the overhead lights. The NCO stripes on my arm looked like bars of gold. Gerald looked at me. He was on his knees now, his wrists locked in the heavy steel of the handcuffs. He looked small. He looked like the dirt I used to scrub off his floors. Dixie, honey, Donna sobbed, her mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks. She tried to reach for me, but the agent pulled her back. Tell them we were good to you. We gave you a home, we fed you. We're your family, Dixie. Please, don't let them do this. I stopped 2 feet away from her. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel the old psyops triggers. I just felt a deep, cleansing coldness. I looked at the woman who had spent 23 years telling me I was born to serve. You fed me scraps, I said. My voice was a flat, clinical report. You gave me a basement, and you tried to bury my name under a pile of lies. I looked at Gerald, then back at Donna. I leaned in just enough so they could see the winter in my eyes. You wanted to forge a soldier, I whispered. You wanted someone who could take the pain without a word. You wanted a tool that wouldn't break. I straightened my back, my chin high. Mission accomplished, I said. You built a soldier, and today, that soldier just destroyed you. The agents hauled them up. Gerald was blubbering, his expensive wool coat bunched up around his neck. Donna was still screaming, her voice fading as they dragged her out the heavy mahogany doors. The sound of their shouting echoed down the hall until it was cut off by the heavy thud of the mansion's front entrance closing. Silence returned to the room. Richard sat there, his head in his hands, finally letting the weight of the truth settle. I stood by the window, watching the black SUVs pull away down the long gravel driveway. The blue and red lights flickered against the trees for a moment, then disappeared into the Connecticut fog. I felt a shadow move behind me. Brandon. He had been silent the whole time, tucked in the corner like a forgotten toy. He looked at the empty room, then at me. His face was a mask of confusion and rising terror. He didn't have his mother to protect him. He didn't have his father's money to hide behind. What about me? He whispered. I didn't answer. I just turned my gaze to the desk where the legal papers were still scattered, and my grip on the future tightened. The gavel didn't just hit the wood, it hit the coffin of the Patterson name. Thud. Federal court in Connecticut is a cold, sterile place. There are no velvet curtains here, just fluorescent lights that make everyone look like they're already in the morgue. Gerald sat there in a cheap suit. The bank had already frozen his assets, so his Italian silk was long gone. He looked smaller, his skin hanging off his jowls like melting wax. Donna was a wreck, her hair unwashed, her eyes darting around the room, looking for a miracle that wasn't coming. The judge didn't care about their standing in Fairfield. He didn't care about their country club memberships. He only cared about the wire transfers and the 23 years of stolen life. Gerald got 18 years. Donna got 12. The aftermath was a scorched earth policy. The colonial dream house on the hill foreclosed. The marble countertops, the manicured lawn, and even the gray concrete floor in that basement where I'd spent my childhood. All of it was seized by the bank to pay off the federal fines and the mounting lawsuits. Every piece of furniture they'd ever bought with my mother's money was sold off at a sheriff's auction. Then there was Brandon. The golden boy had fallen the hardest. The Whitmores hadn't just walked away from the wedding. They'd burned the bridge and salted the earth. Brandon was left holding the bill for a $47,000 party that never happened, plus another $150,000 in personal debt Gerald had hidden in his name. The manager title at the firm was gone. His friends, those wax-dipped shadows from the ballroom, vanished the second the cuffs came out. Brandon went from a prince to a parasite without a host. 6 months later. I was sitting in a quiet office in Greenwich. The air was clean, smelling of old books and high-end security. Richard had officially transferred the trust. $12 million. A legacy built on my mother's grief, now sitting in an account with my name on it, Dixie Ashford Whitmore. I was tapping my fingers on the desk, the rhythmic click-clack of my nails against the mahogany, the only sound in the room. Then, the burner phone on the table buzzed. A restricted number. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. "Yeah," I said. My voice was flat, like a dead phone line. "Dixie, is that you?" Brandon's voice was a ragged mess. He sounded like he'd been gargling gravel and cheap whiskey. I could hear the background noise, the hiss of a bus air brake, the shouting of a crowded street. A shelter, maybe. Or a greasy spoon diner where he was nursing a coffee he couldn't afford. "I heard about the trust," he whined, his voice breaking into a sob that was 100% fake. "I'm in trouble, sis. Real trouble. The collectors? They're gonna break my legs. I'm sleeping in my car, Dixie. It's freezing out here. You got 12 million. Just 10,000. That's a rounding error for you. For old time's sake, we grew up together." I leaned back in the chair, my heart rate not even twitching. I looked at the scars on my knuckles, the ones I'd earned fixing his mistakes and scrubbing his floors. "We didn't grow up together, Brandon," I said. My voice was a scalpel. "I was the help. You were the one who threw your dirty laundry at my head and laughed when Gerald took the cane to me. Tell me something. In 23 years, did you ever once stand between me and that cane? Did you ever bring me a glass of water when I was locked in the dark? Did you ever look at me and see a human being?" The line went silent for a heartbeat. I could hear him breathing, a shallow, desperate panting. "I was just a kid, Dixie. I didn't know. They lied to me, too." "You knew enough to enjoy the service," I countered. "You knew enough to call me the help in front of your rich friends while my hand was bleeding onto the floor. You didn't just watch me drown. You held my head under the water so you could stay dry." "Please," he whimpered. "I'm your brother." "No," I said. "You're a debt that's finally been collected." I felt a wave of emptiness wash over me. It wasn't sad. It was just done. Like a mission where every target had been neutralized and there was nothing left to do but extract. I used the language I'd learned in the mud, the only language that ever meant anything. Action has consequences, Brandon. Silence has them too. Support protocol is denied. Don't call this number again. You're officially off the grid. Wait, Dixie, don't. Signal lost. Out. I pressed the red button. The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. I didn't just turn the phone off. I popped the back open, pulled out the SIM card, and snapped the plastic in half. The crack was sharp and final. I tossed the pieces into the trash can next to the desk. I stood up, my back straight, my posture perfect. I wasn't wearing the dress blues today, just a sharp black coat, but the soldier was still there, etched into my bones. I walked out to the driveway where a black SUV was waiting. The driver held the door open. "Where to, Miss Whitmore?" I looked at my watch. It was time. "The Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury," I said. I had one more protocol to finish. I needed to look Gerald and Donna in the eye, not as their servant and not as their ghost. I needed them to see exactly what they'd built before I walked away forever. The engine roared to life, the tires crunching over the expensive gravel as we headed for the highway. The past was in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in my life, I was the one behind the wheel. The Federal Correctional Institution in McKean sat like a concrete scar on the Pennsylvania landscape. The air inside was heavy, smelling of industrial floor wax, bleached laundry, and the quiet, suffocating rot of men who had nowhere left to go. I sat at the visitor station, the reinforced glass cold against my knuckles. The hum of a nearby vending machine was the only sound in the small partitioned booth. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't bring Richard. I came alone, carrying nothing but the weight of 23 years and the name I had finally reclaimed. Gerald shuffled into the room. He wasn't the man from Fairfield anymore. The charcoal suits and the arrogance were gone, replaced by a cheap orange jumpsuit that hung off his skeletal frame like a dirty tarp. He looked at me, his eyes darting around the room, still looking for a way to manipulate the situation. He leaned against the glass, his breath fogging the surface, his hands shaky and pale. "Dixie," he croaked. His voice was a dry rattle, stripped of its old power. "I heard about the trust. You gotta help me, honey. My lawyers, they're taking everything. They won't let me out for another 15 years. You know I didn't mean it. We gave you a life, didn't we? We kept you off the street. We were your family when you had nobody." I looked at him, my pulse not even ticking up a single beat. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel the satisfaction I thought I'd have. I just felt a cold, flat distance that stretched for miles. I watched his shaky hands press against the glass, the same hands that had held the rattan cane and the leather belt. The same hands that had signed the check for $15,000 to buy a stolen baby. "I wasn't born to serve you, Gerald," I said. My voice was steady, like a hammer hitting a nail into a coffin. "I wasn't born to be a ghost in your basement or a tool for your ego. I was born with a name you tried to erase, but the name stayed. The girl you tried to break? She didn't break. She just learned how to fight." He started to babble, his words a messy pile of excuses and half-baked lies. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. I leaned in close to the glass, my eyes locked onto his until he finally went silent, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. "I'm stripping away the last of it today," I whispered. "The shame? The guilt you tried to bury me in for 20 years? It ain't mine. It never was. I'm giving it all back to you. You can rot in here with the truth. I'm done being your victim. I'm done being your help. I'm just done." I stood up, my back straight, my posture reflecting the thousands of hours I'd spent on the parade ground. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't look back as he started to scream for me to come back. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel doors. The sound of my heels on the linoleum was the only thing in the hallway. Click, click, click. A rhythmic military cadence. I pushed through the final heavy gate and stepped into the afternoon. The air was cold, a sharp New England bite that felt like a baptism. I took a deep breath, the oxygen filling my lungs for the first time in 23 years. The ghost of the Fairfield basement was gone. The servant was dead. 6 months later, I moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment in New Haven. It wasn't a mansion on a hill. It was better. It had huge windows that looked out over the oak trees of the park. And for the first time in my life, there were no locks on the outside of my door. The sunlight cut across the hardwood floors in long, golden slashes, lighting up the space with a warmth I'd never known. My army dress blues hung in the closet, the brass buttons polished to a mirror finish. Next to them sat a stack of heavy textbooks. I'd used my GI Bill to enroll at Yale. Psychology. I didn't want to just be a soldier anymore. I wanted to be the one who pulled the next kid out of the dark. I spent my nights studying the way minds break and how they heal, using the same discipline I'd used to survive the army to master the books. My internal clock didn't care about the new life. It still hit the alarm at 0400 every morning. But I didn't wake up to the sound of Donna screaming for breakfast or the dread of a fresh bruise. I woke up to the silence of my own home. I sat at the small kitchen table, the smell of fresh ground coffee filling the air. It was a good smell. Rich, earthy, and real. Next to my dog tags lay an old, yellowed envelope Richard had found in my mother's private safe. I pulled out the letter. The paper was thin, worn at the edges from years of being hidden away. I traced the curves of the ink, the handwriting of a woman I'd never known but had fought for every single day. "My dearest Dixie," it started, "you were born for extraordinary things. You were born to be a light in a world that can be very dark. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you are anything less than a miracle. You are loved, you are wanted, you are home." I sat there in the quiet of the morning, the light starting to creep over the horizon. I looked at the dog tags, then at the letter. I wasn't just a sergeant anymore. I wasn't just a Whitmore. I was a survivor, a soldier, and a daughter who had finally found the way back to the start. I took a sip of the coffee, the heat spreading through my chest. I looked at the clock. It was 0500. The sun was up, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the day. I stood up and walked toward the window, ready for the next mission.